Hi, welcome to Sparkle, where we inspire, connect, and encourage women in their faith. And today we have a wonderful guest, Carla Chennault, who is joining us. And she's a Bloomfield resident. She has a wonderful, supportive husband. She's been married for a while because she has two beautiful girls who are doing well. And Carla is an educator. And we'll let you talk to us a little bit about who you are, Carla, and then we'll go into your story.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it, Betsy. So like you said, I'm a resident here in Bloomfield, Michigan. Been an educator for a long time. I'm currently the education director for ADL Michigan. ADL is the Anti-Defamation League, and we stand against the defamation of Jewish people, and we stand for the just and fair treatment of all people. So I partner with schools, K-12 schools, and try to help support their diversity, equity, and inclusion work.
Oh, I love that. And how long have you been doing that?
Actually, it's just been a year. It was a year back in November. So prior to that, I was a principal at a high school. And prior to that, I was an English teacher and a department chair for, 20 years.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So you've been around the block and you've got a good reputation in that field, in the education field. So we appreciate you joining us this morning. And I know you have a strong faith, and I wanted you to maybe remember the first time, or tell us a little bit about the first time you encountered faith and kind of what that was like for you.
Sure. Well, it's funny because I have been walking with Christ for a long time, and I have a very strong faith and relationship with him. But I don't have one of these fantastic, moments where, I came to believe. Normally when I think about it, I think about, when I was 16, I used to go to church. And I would go to church, I would just kind of walk. There was a church not too far from where I lived in Atlanta, Georgia. And, one Sunday, the pastor, did his thing and did an altar call. And I just felt led to walk to the front of the church and accept Jesus. But when I stopped to think even more about it, and I listened to your other guests and, that you interviewed for this podcast, and I was reminded that, in fact, when I was very young, when I could read, an English teacher, I love language, I love to read. Well, my grandmother she was an English professor, a college professor, and she used to have me read the Bible to her. She enjoyed that, and I used to like to read out loud. And when I think about that, I really do think that's where God planted his word into my heart at a very sort of young age. It was when I was 16 that I accepted Christ for myself. And then from there, I just have grown in my faith and have learned kind of what it means to move from, having a religion, being a Christian, to actually really being in relationship and being a follower of Christ. And so that's kind of where I find myself now.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I know, so what how has that transformed your life? How have you become a follower? And maybe tell us some steps that you've taken to become a follower of Christ.
Sure. Well, I've always, and I don't know why it is, I don't know if it's because when I grew up, I don't know if you know Judy Blume's book, Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. Yeah. But, that was one of my favorites. And I've always written letters to God, even all through college. Even though I wasn't going to church, I would always just write to God, instead of keeping a diary necessarily. I'd always just say, dear God, and I'd always kind of share my needs or whatever with him. And that kind of carried me through, my early 20s and so forth and so on. When I married and had children and started going to church, that's when I would meet older believers and more mature believers. And I, got involved with women's Bible studies. And even today, I'm in a women's Bible study. And that's where I started to understand a little bit more about what it means. And I don't know how old I was, but I did a Bible study. I don't know if you remember Kay Arthur and Precepts Ministries. that was one of my very first sort of indoctrinations into studying the word. And if you know anything about those studies, I mean, they are like, deep, 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 deep study. But I'm an English teacher. I love to annotate text. And so it was right up my alley. And our first study was the names of God, right? And that was when I really started to see who God was, El Shaddai and, Jehovah Rapha and Jehovah Jireh, the Lord who provides, Jehovah Rapha, the Lord who heals, and really started to understand his character and who he was, the essence of who he was. And that's also when I started to understand that this walk is about a relationship, knowing him, he knows me, and building that relationship. And it's just strengthens with time, like with anything. And so that's kind of what I've done. And even to this day, I continue to study the Bible. I study it every day. I journal every day, dear God, and I date it and just kind of pour out my life to him. So I do go to church. The pandemic kind of threw me off a little bit because now I have a church that I really love that's online.
Yeah.
So sometimes I go to church online, but I do believe in the power of fellowship and accountability and serving too,
Yes.
being in a church to give back and tithing. I've always, ever since I've had an income, I've always tithed. I think that's an important discipline. So, I am very disciplined in the faith. But the bottom line for me is that it is a relationship. And over the years, I've gotten to know who God is. I've gotten to understand how he speaks and how he speaks to me. And I try to listen. I do try to listen. Sometimes, he speaks something exciting and wonderful, and he's taking you to a new place and a new adventure. And other times he speaks and it's, a bit of a premonition. I was reminded of that as I was listening back. You did the Susan Sorensen interview.
Oh, yeah.
Well, as it turns out, I don't know if you know this, but I'm a cancer survivor.
Oh,
right?
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and this is her book. Obviously, it's
Oh,
blue now.
amazing.
This is the pink one.
Yeah.
And and I'm reminded of that because I was walking very closely with God when I got cancer, and that really threw me a little bit, right? Because I'm serving him, I'm loving him. Like, wait a minute, what's up? But it was something that he had spoken to me in advance, and that did give me a sense of peace as I went through that journey. And I didn't meet Susan, I met Lori.
Laura, yeah.
Is it Laura? And she gave me a copy of this book when I was going through.
That is such a dear story. Well, I know in talking to you and receiving some notes from you earlier, you mentioned that sometimes when you walk in faith, it can be dark. You don't know what the next steps are. Maybe you can address some of that in your life where God has encouraged you or you've stepped out.
Yeah, I mean, he does that, and when you listen to him and he prompts your spirit, and you're willing to be obedient and follow, you're gonna go someplace and you don't really know where you're going. And I mean, that has happened in my life. A few years back, I left my job. I was working at a private school, local private school, and I really felt like he was telling me it was time to go. And I didn't know where we were going. I had the privilege of having a husband who had a job and health insurance and all that. So it was a privilege to be able to kind of walk away from where I was. But it was just interesting because nobody really fully understood. What do you mean? You're retiring? No, I'm not retiring. I'm on a faith journey. God has called me, and he says he's taking me someplace else. And so stepping into that and then not knowing where you're going and having to trust him, and you don't have the control, and you can't make it work. You have to just let him lead. And and that's hard. Now, that wasn't necessarily dark. I felt like that was, something that was going to ultimately be very exciting. Although there were days when I couldn't see him, I couldn't hear him, I couldn't feel him. I'm like, where are we? What's happening? And then if you ask him, he'll give you a little bit of a lighthouse. We're over here, keep moving. So it's interesting.
And that's one of the most difficult parts of walking in faith. I mean, but that is what faith is walking in the dark when you can't see anything. So I know you had some closing notes about encouraging people in following Christ. Do you have any thing you want to add before we close?
One of the things that I noted and that I try to share, when I'm meeting a seeker or when I'm meeting a relatively new believer, is just that, God, first of all, there's no condemnation in this faith. There's no judgment from, at least don't receive any judgment from the world.
Mhm.
Know that God judges the heart. He sees your heart. And I always try to encourage people, stay authentic, stay true. If you're struggling or you have doubts, take them to God. First of all, he already knows, but he responds to authenticity. So if you're seeking, ask him to show himself to you, to make himself manifest. He will do it.
Mhm.
If you're a new believer and you want sort of those confirmations and affirmations, he will do it. And then as you walk through this journey and you have tough times, you come out of a cancer journey or you lose your job, keep that heart pure. Don't let bitterness take root. Don't let unforgiveness take root. Take that pain, give it to God. He will work you through it, and he will get you to the other side. So that
No,
would be what
I,
I'd
I love that. I love that. You've got some really good closing remarks there. So I think anybody can follow one of those paths. And we just thank you for joining us, Carla, on Sparkle, and for your input and your advice. And thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time.